Morning, Jim.
Morning, Steve.
How are you?
How are you this morning?
I'm a little bit tired, but okay. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm not a little bit tired, so I'm better than you, obviously.
Yeah. So this week we are talking about the cost of software projects, or the total cost, or potentially where those costs could go. So I thought we'd start off with something that I have generally witnessed in sort of my dealings, especially with clients. I normally get asked, how much is it going to be to build X or build Y, whether that's a website or an app or a platform or a product. It's, can you give me a quote? Can you give me a price on something? And generally what I've found, obviously dependent upon the size of the project, is that the price that they're looking for is the development costs, essentially the upfront costs of the project. And what I mean by upfront cost, I think, the planning, the system design, the architecture, things like design, UX, the actual development, the testing, potentially even things like content authoring and stuff like that, or those types of things that require the thing to be built and to be put live. And that also may incur costs around DevOps and deployment and things like that. But what they don't take into account is the cost of maintenance, the cost of support, which I would classify as sort of maintenance costs. So how much does it cost to keep the lights on, to keep the system up to date, security updates, patches, even future enhancements maybe. And also the operational costs. So how much does it keep the for it to run, basically? So so things like staff costs, how many people is it required to hire to run the system, to operate the system, hosting costs potentially, licensing costs if you're using third-party software. And I think generally what I try to discuss with clients is sometimes if you spend a little bit more in the development area, it will save further on down the line. An example of that would be automation or integration. So let's say you had an e-commerce website, and that e-commerce website was taking orders, and let's say you took one order every week, not a lot of orders. The manual effort to process those orders will be minimal. You could probably, if you're a small business owner, deal with that yourself. If that was 1,000 orders a week, you probably would need to hire two or three people, let's say, to manage those orders. Whereas if you was to spend a little bit of money up front on the development, you could integrate with, I don't know, a fulfillment system, a warehouse system or something like that, or an ERP, to avoid the manual entry, which obviously would reduce errors as well, but obviously, take away that person's role essentially. So you don't need to pay someone because the computer's doing the work for you. So integration, sort of automation as well, so getting things to be done for you as opposed to having someone do them for you. But when clients ask for a price, they don't consider those things. They don't consider that if you spend a little bit more, you could save a lot more over the course of, let's say, 12 months. Have you saw with that at all and witnessed any of that?
Yeah, no, I think it's very very common. But I think what you're also kind of highlighting in what you're saying is the difference between in-house and using an external agency to develop.
Yeah.
And for me, in-house normally is better about thinking about those things, because generally they have to pull together a business case. And pretty much every business case for a piece of IT software says we can save X number of people's jobs, we can make people redundant, the system will take over, and it'll all be great. The reality is it never is, but that's by the by. So I think when you get into internal business case development, those types of things generally are considered. But there is a a definite challenge when you're going out to an external agency and saying, give us a price. And that challenge is exactly what you said, that they are not collaborating well enough to understand 5% extra on the cost will actually change your business case fundamentally. And I think a huge part of that is the procurement process. I know several procurement people, and I like them as individuals, but their job function, I think, is challenging.
Yeah.
In that they're not thinking about business value, they're only thinking about lowest cost.
Yeah.
And I think that partly comes into what you're saying as well. It's we want someone to build this system at the lowest cost possible, when the reality is, if you collaborate with whoever's building it, you can actually change the outcome of what the business is trying to achieve by that collaboration. Do you know that actually we've got a module we can just plug in, it's dead easy, that will talk to your HR system, it will talk to your payroll system, it will talk to your warehousing system, whatever those things are. And it may be a minuscule extra cost, but because you're in this competitive world of procurement, everything that the client hasn't asked you for is an extra cost that makes you less competitive.
Yeah.
And that's just not the case.
And that's the total cost of ownership, isn't it? Essentially, it's the same old adage of, razors and razor blades. So it's cheap to buy a razor, but the blades themselves are expensive, and that's how they earn their money. Printers and printer cartridges is another example. I know a friend of mine, it was cheaper for him to actually replace the whole printer that got free cartridges with the printer than to replace all the cartridges, which was absolutely crazy. So yeah, I think this total cost of ownership in terms of, you've got your system, you don't want to spend 10 times more than it cost you to build to actually run it. And I think future enhancements as well is another one. I mean, having the right architecture in place, that sort of like a modular architecture, for example, or a service-based architecture that allows you to add new functionality easy and more efficiently, will cut the cost down of future enhancements. And not putting that work up front and allowing and essentially just doing a bish bash bosh on it, what you'll find is that any future enhancements will cost a lot more, probably.
But I equally, I think there's a few things in there, and I'm not always I don't always agree with you in every circumstance. I think having an architecture which is fairly flexible is just sensible anyway. And I don't think that particularly adds anything to the upfront costs. You have to architect it in some way, so you may as well do it in a logical, structured way. But I think you can get into the danger of future-proofing a system and then never actually updating it in the future. So all you've really done is you've added time and cost onto the first implementation for something. For something that you might never need in the future. So I think you need to be cautious about what you do up front, accepting the fact that actually it might cost you more in future if you do want to enhance it. But you know what? Because you didn't do that work up front, you got to market quicker. The system's in, you're getting the financial benefits of it sooner. And that can very often outweigh the future. We might do something in the future that would need this different thing. But it's one of the reasons that in IT, you have to think about the total cost of ownership. And for me, it's one of the big reasons that companies are moving away from IT projects into IT products. And they're looking at products, because a product has a life cycle. It goes beyond the initial development. A product has a cycle. It goes beyond the finance people's, we need a 12-month cost. It's kind of like, you don't build a system, whatever it is, whether it's a e-commerce system, a warehouse integration system, whatever it is, you don't build it, launch it, and then walk away and say, job well done, let's go to the pub, we're all good. It has an ongoing cost. Finance people like those costs in 3 and 5 year cycles and what you're spending next 12 months. But even that doesn't really reflect what happens. So I think total cost of ownership, the total understanding of the product that you're building and what it does and the length it will take. But I think there's a caution in there of future-proofing everything is rarely the right idea, because of the cost it takes you in the initial phases, but equally giving yourself some flexibility where you know there's going to be some future changes.
Yeah, totally agree. I think that context is key. As you say, if it's a brochureware website that will be updated once every 6 months, keep it simple. If it's a product or a platform that is, as you say, that has ongoing development, then it is quite critical that you've planned for that and you've architected it in the right way.
I mean, the other part of it, and I think we spoke about this before, or I spoke to someone about this in the last couple of weeks, is an awful lot of systems that you get involved in building are actually legacy systems that you're improving. And legacy systems never have a plug-and-play architecture. They're always big monoliths. And that actually helps you understand much better which parts of the system are you touching, which parts of the system need to be updated on a regular basis. What is the roadmap? What parts are you going to be changing in 12 months as opposed to every week, every month? And it helps you understand and bring in that mindset of this part of the system needs to be updated constantly. These other parts, once every couple of years, we'll worry about it when we want to upgrade it. So it brings that thinking in on legacy systems, even if you're using that same thinking later with a new build.
Yeah. So how do you think procurement teams should sort of change their sort of ways of working, I guess, and when they are working with third-party agencies, to sort of encompass that total cost of ownership as opposed to just upfront costs? How do you think they should change that?
Oh wow, you're getting into a huge topic now, aren't you? For me, the challenge is less procurement. Procurement are the surface element that everyone sees. The challenge is, for me, is it comes down to risk and reward. Procurement being one element of that, or one extreme of that. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to move all of the risk from the client to the agency. So the client doesn't want to risk anything. It all moves to the agency. And therefore, to do that, you need to have a very clear scope, a very clear price, a very clear timeline, which the agency is 100% responsible for delivering. And that means that the agency is taking on all of the risk. Client gets what they wanted. It's a fixed cost. It's a fixed time. They know exactly what it is they get. But when you get into total cost of ownership and adding business value through that, you're at the exact opposite end of that. What you want is an agency that is collaborating, an agency that's feeding back, an agency that's telling you that your business users are actually interacting with the system in a different way than you thought they would, or your customers are interacting with it in a different way you thought you would. And those things you can't specify up front. You can't specify how a consumer is going to interact with your e-commerce site 12 months ahead. So you need to have that flexibility built in. And that means the risk has to be shared between the agency and the client so that actually there's flexibility. And it's a collaborative way of working, and it's a more positive way of working because you're all in it together. So for me, I would much prefer to see companies accepting that there's a risk in what they're doing, working with agencies to mitigate the risks for both parties, working together with a clear outcome for the business. And to be honest, if you want to kind of align the objectives, give the agency bonuses. This is what we're trying to achieve. Rather than beating them over the head to get the price as low as they can, if you're achieving your milestones, pay the agency. So if an agency is going to charge £1,000 a day for a senior developer, a CTO person, maybe actually you come to an agreement whereby they only charge you £700 a day, but you get a £500 a day bonus if they meet the target in 3 months' time. So there's a bit of the risk is being shared, but also a bit of the bonus is being shared. The reward is there as well. And be much more collaborative in that way of working.
But do you think those financial incentives are going to, again, work against the collaborative? I think what I heard there was there's generally with an agency, it's sort of like a supplier relationship. Here's some cash, build us X. We don't want to be paying any more cash. We want it to be done on time, on budget, yada yada yada, good quality. And as soon as you turn that into more of a partnership, as you say, more of a collaborative environment and relationship, that you're making decisions and compromises along the way that could affect those costs, could affect the timings, but for the right reasons. So as soon as you start putting incentives on top of that, especially to hit deadlines or whatever, then isn't it going to be rightly or wrongly pushing the agency down a route of, okay, we will do it in a certain way, which may cost them more later on, but it will mean that we will get an extra £300 a day for it.
Yes and no. And this is then about aligning objectives. If you misalign the objectives that you're bonusing someone on, whether it's an agency or an employee, you will get bad behavior, you'll get bizarre behavior. An example being, I worked with a company in Switzerland. They were merging two companies together, and the second company that they were merging, they had bought. So it was an acquisition. The CTO was getting a payout, but he only got his payout once he had merged the platforms together. And his objective was that basic. It was merge the platforms together. I could prove to them that if they did it in a certain sequence, number one thing they needed to do was to merge the search function because the second platform didn't have one. I could prove to them that doing that is the first piece of functionality you're integrating would generate them 2.6 million over 6 months. So that paid for the integration cost itself, just by not changing what you were doing, but just sequencing it in the right way. But the CTO wasn't bonused on making extra money. He wasn't bonused on paying for the integration. He was bonused on having the single platform. And because of that, anything that changed away from essentially a waterfall, big bang, we're going to do everything, it's going to be perfect, we'll go live, was a risk to him, his bonus, and what he was achieving, even though the business actually lost significantly because of it. So I think in this regard, it's about aligning those objectives. And I think if you've got a collaborative working between the client and the agency building your software, and the agency know that their costs are covered, they're fine. They're okay. They're in no real incentive to cut corners because actually they're getting paid for what they're doing. And it's good and it's collaborative and they're working for the client.
Yeah.
It's then incumbent on the agency to actually help the client meet its business objectives, not just hit a milestone. It's meet that objective. And the bonuses should not be for deliver a piece of software. The bonus should be for, we want 10,000 users on our platform after the first 3 months or whatever it is. So they need to be aligned to the business objectives. And that way it's incumbent on them. If they can do it cheaper, great, because you're doing it quicker. They're still getting their bonus. They're getting their bonus quicker in the process, but they're aligned to those business objectives.
Okay. I mean, depending on how savvy the client is, what they might not understand is that certain decisions are being made along the way that prevent future enhancements being as optimal as they could have been. So let's say that the agency or the dev agency has produced a piece of software, and to add a new piece of functionality or to enhance something, if they would have done it in a certain way, it could be, let's say, 3 weeks of work. But because they've done it in a different way, a more, I guess, easier way, then it's 6 weeks worth of work. Now, for one piece of functionality, that's not a big issue, but you do that across a year, across multiple sprints and multiple enhancements, you're essentially paying 50% on top of everything that you're doing that you would have done if you'd have put the investment up front at the start. So I guess the success criteria that you're measured by at the time of initial release is very difficult to put in place, because you don't know what the next feature will be and how much it would have been if you'd have done something differently. So how would you sort of measure that? I think it's
but in all of that, and I agree with all of that, but all of that is based on one premise, that your external agency is building the initial piece of software and then they're leaving you. And I think if you're going to have a collaborative partnership, then the agency you're using needs to be longer term. So it's not a launch this piece of software and then go away, we'll manage it ourselves. It's the total cost of that product, that system.
Yeah.
And therefore that means our roadmap is 3 years long. Phase one is we want to get live with an MVP, whatever it is. The MVP criteria is this. The first release criteria is something else. The second release criteria is something else. And if the agency building it knows what that long-term plan is, knows that if they produce quality, they are getting that ongoing piece of work for 2, 3, 5 years, then it's incumbent on them to go back to the client and say, phase 3, you want us to build this software, this function onto this, but in phase 1, we're actually laying the groundwork. It's now your choice, Mr. Client. Do you want us to take a bit longer? Keep in mind that our milestone will move. That will change that relationship. But we can build it better now to make 3 years easier. Or the opportunity cost is the roadmap's going to change in 18 months. We kind of know that. So there's no point building in flexibility for year 3 if we think it's going to lose. Just get it done quickly. We'll take the value that we get now. We'll take the consumers using the product, making money. And if it costs us a bit extra in 3 years' time, then we'll bear the cost of that. So those are the conversations you'd expect through the collaboration process, the partnership process, that this type of way of working brings, if everyone's aligned, as opposed to I'm running a project, I'll give you a price for the project, the scope's fixed. What you do after that is entirely up to you. I don't care. And therefore you've got it. And it goes back in software terms for me to the old, the whole rise of DevOps. One of the key benefits of DevOps for me was the engineer that actually wrote the code is the engineer that supports the code. As opposed to in the bad old days, an engineer would write stuff, throw it over to the QA guy who would test it, kind of be forced through a number of scenarios that whether they worked or not was highly unlikely, because they were testing software, not understanding the business. And then it get thrown over the fence to the systems guys, the web ops guys, or whoever you've got to support. So when the system broke on a Sunday night at 2 o'clock in the morning, the engineer who created the problem wasn't the one that was getting the call.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. It's the same logic with these external agencies. They need to be bought in long term. They need to be rewarded long term for what they're doing. But then they need to be collaborative in doing that.
I guess when you say the bad old days, I mean, it depends how far you go back, because when I started, you needed to do everything. You were designing, you were building, you're deploying, you're maintaining. Yeah, you had to sing the theme tune, write the theme tune, and you were the only person. The book stopped with you.
I go back 21 years of working formally in technology projects. And 21 years ago, I was working with a consultancy that was employed by Royal Bank of Scotland, Bank of Scotland. And that was how they did it. You had one bunch of guys who wrote the code. They fired it over a wall to the QA guys who tested it. And the tests were never truly aligned to the business needs. So you were testing something that was irrelevant to the business, but the software passed. Yeah. It then got thrown over the wall to the operations team, who then had to support it. No matter what pile of poo they had just inherited, it was their job to support it. And it was just illogical. Everyone did it. There's even companies that still do that today. Everyone did it because at the time it was the best thinking that we had. But I think we've kind of grown up and we've matured as an industry of technology that we kind of know it's not the best way to work. That there needs to be better collaboration between technology and the business. I very often tell people that there isn't technology and the business. There is only the business. Yeah. Technology is part of the business. Everyone's paid out the same bank account. It's bizarre to me that we view them separately. And everyone should have the same objectives and the same KPIs. It's like there's no point building a system if it doesn't add business benefit to you. So that's the KPIs that everyone's measured against, including the technology guys.
Yeah. Okay. One thing I wanted to talk about, just moving off to a different tact, is the cost of bespoke software development versus, I guess, a hybrid of using off-the-shelf components or libraries versus open source versus even third-party services. So I was asked a question yesterday actually by a client, and who's a startup. They're looking to get to market relatively quickly, and asked me the question, would you use something that was open source, and what would be your thought process on making those sort of decisions around whether to build something from scratch or to use something that's off the shelf. And my answer to him was, as always, it depends. And
the answer to everything, really.
It does. And I said, if you could go out there and do a little bit of research, you want to build X, if you could get something that's open source that does X perfectly, then great. Review it, understand it, make sure it's fully supported, make sure you can take ownership of it if you needed to. So it's a technology that you're au fait with, or your devs are au fait with. There's longevity there, potentially any security issues or bugs, so it's good quality software, it's well supported. As I said, the licensing side of things as well, making sure if you're using that in a commercial product that you can do that. But as I said, it's very unlikely that you'll get 100% match unless you're building something that is very common. Then you're not going to do that. What you could end up finding is something that is either 130% of what you want, so it does what you want and more, or the other side, which is 70% of what you want. Now, they're just as bad as each other a little bit, because if you're getting something that does more than what you need it to do, potentially that could cause issues, more maintenance. It could have security implications, bugs that could affect other parts of the system, depending on how it's been architected. And a good example of that is if you've got a website, and let's say it's got its own inventory already, so you're listing your products on there, but it's not e-commerce, and you want to turn your website into e-commerce. Now, what you could do is buy something off the shelf like Magento or Shopify or something like that, or Nopcommerce, and retrofit that, and take your existing website and pump it into that new platform. So obviously the issues with that is that you've got to transfer all the content over, you've got to maybe restructure your inventory, your data model and all that stuff. But depending on the products that you've got, it might be not an exact fit. So for example, if your products are cars, if you're selling cars online, you don't need a basket. You don't need to buy more than one car in one go. It's very unlikely that's the case. You don't need 2-for-1 offers. You don't need bundling of products. So if you was to take Magento as an example and put that on a car dealer website, probably 90% of Magento isn't going to get used. Whereas what you could do is just stick a checkout piece of functionality onto the back of your existing website, and just port that product in, put it through a payment provider, and it will cost far less in terms of integration costs. Something like Magento would be on a 3-month upgrade cycle. It's tied to PHP, which is also on its own life cycle. So before you know it, if you've adopted Magento for something that could be really simple checkout integration, your maintenance costs are going to shoot through the roof, because you're upgrading every 3 months to keep it up to date. They've just gone through a massive version as well, from sort of from a monolith to more of a headless sort of e-commerce product. So you might have issues with backward compatibility in the future. All of that could go away just by thinking of something slightly different. Now, if you looked at the other of the 70%, then you're going to get to a level of, well, if that thing doesn't do what you want it to do fully, there'll be a percentage threshold that says, well, it's not really worth adopting. The cost of adoption, the cost of learning it, the cost of understanding it, and potentially, as I say, maintaining it may not be worthwhile as opposed to building it from scratch. So all of these things I would take into consideration. But also, what you don't want to do is reinvent the wheel. And I think that's another thing. So there will be areas, things like, frameworks. So things like .NET framework or React or Angular and those types of front-end frameworks that you wouldn't want to build yourself. They're well supported, they have longevity, it's proven. Just use what's there. Obviously, understand the skill set that you have in house, or if you're looking to recruit, make sure that skill set is available in your area if it's if people are working on site. But overall, there's certain things that are quite easy to adopt. The finer grained components and things like that. Cloud platforms are quite easy to adopt, but off the shelf products, like a ready-made shell of a product, I think you've got to be quite wary of.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. For me, a couple of things in there. I have a very simplistic view of all of that, which I'll come back to in a minute. But the aligning objectives example I gave you, that company actually had Magento 1.9.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time they were standardizing across both companies on Magento 1.9. Magento 2.1 was released, and there is no upgrade path beyond 2. So they were standardizing on a platform that was already out of date, meant that they were going to have to support it themselves, meant that they were going to have to do all of these things themselves, which is just bonkers.
Yeah.
But it highlights the fact that as soon as you get into off the shelf, whether it's bought off the shelf, whether it's free software or open source software, there's constraints to it. And you need to accept those constraints, and those constraints come with a cost, like you said, of maintenance and things. But I think there's probably, for me anyway, a simpler way of looking at it. If the software that you're going has a constraint, then can you live with those constraints,
mm-hmm.
or can't you? And the simplest way that I look at it is, if you can buy the same software as I can buy, where's the unique selling point? Where's the point of differentiation between you and I as companies?
Yeah.
So I very simplistically view it as, if what you're building is a differentiator, a unique selling point to your customers, build it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
If what you're doing is a back-end warehousing system or a payment processing system or an HR system, they're just givens. Customers don't see them. There's no value add to them. There's no unique selling point. Customers just expect you to have an HR system and a payroll system for your employees. That's irrelevant. So for me, the fact that you can buy the same software as I can buy is irrelevant.
Yeah.
So I would always buy back-end type systems unless you've got a really niche business. But front-end stuff that the customers touch, you want that to be different. You want that to look like your business. You want that to be different to everyone else. You want it to be better. You want to be able to build in your own function set, your own user experience, your own user journeys that make you unique. And that predominantly means bespoke.
Yeah, competitive edge for sure.
Yeah.
I think another sweet spot. So we talked a little bit about open source and things then, but I think a good balance is third-party services. So as an example of that, let's say you had a search functionality. We talked about search earlier. So you got a product that you needed a product-wide search, and generally what you would do for that is some type of indexing or an inverted index type of search. So one of the most popular is Elasticsearch, which is based on Lucene. And there's multiple ways of implementing Elasticsearch. So it's open source, so you can take it and use it and host it yourself and do what you want with it. There's obviously plugins as well to extend it, but there's a lot of maintenance involved with doing that. If you wanted to have the ultimate flexibility on that product, that's the way you would go. But there's a cost of total cost of ownership with hosting something like that yourself. The other option will be to use I guess the next level would be a hosted service. So Elastic company themselves host or have a SaaS version of that product, so you can subscribe to their service. It's got obviously it's paid for, so it has an SLA and stuff like that associated with it, but they upgrade it, they keep it secure, and they maintain it for you. So you're taking a chunk of that maintenance away. It also has plugins, or a subset of plugins that you can use. So there's a little bit of, I guess, flexibility with that model. Not as much as the last one, but a bit more.
Yeah. And
then you could take it another step further. So if you look at something like Azure Search, so let's say you're hosted on Azure and your developers know Azure inside out. Azure Search is also based on Elasticsearch, but it's a very cut down version. It's commoditized. It does the basics really well, but it's really easy to use, really easy to adopt. But you can't put plugins on it. So depending on which one you need, obviously you could go with the Azure Search to start with, get to market quicker, and then at a later date swap it out for the other service. And again, once you've outgrown that, move it to the fully hosted solution of your own, maintaining yourself. But there's a clear plan of action, and I think this is going back to the roadmap side of things, is that what do you need for your MVP, for example? What do you need to get out to the market in 3 to 6 months? And it may be that the Azure Search does that, but it's one component part. It's one service that automatically is separated from the rest of your product, and it has its own upgrade path. And that at certain point, let's say you'll need some advanced spatial search, for example, and Azure Search can't do that, so you would move to the next one, or natural language processing or something like that. You would need to sort of upgrade. As soon as you come to that requirement, that you need to upgrade, but it's a conscious decision. It's a conscious decision that you've gone and made. You've not just gone, let's just do Azure Search because we know it and it's easy. You're doing it because it's getting you to where you need to get to before.
I like conscious decision making, and it's something that vast majority of people haven't quite grasped. They very often do it, but it's not something that is a kind of front of mind concept. Because absolutely, your example of search is you want to get out there, you want to get out there quickly. And with something like search, especially if it's AI-based search, then you need time to learn. You need time for the system to be in operation to make it work properly. So waiting 6 months to get the right search and then learning how it works is irrelevant to getting out there next month and learning from it. But equally, I think using third-party software, again, I have a very simplistic view on that. And your example of search is a good one. If you're using a third-party piece of software, which is their core business, so a search company's core business is providing search to allow you to add that into your system. That's one aspect of using a third-party system. The other aspect of using a third-party system is where you're building your business based off of a Facebook API or a Twitter API. And the simplicity for me is never build your business off someone else's business.
Correct.
Twitter, Facebook, they don't care about that API. It's an add-on. It's a mere fraction of what they're doing, and they can turn it off tomorrow without actually recognizing that they've just completely destroyed your own business. So be cautious about building your business off of someone else's business. But if that other person's business is search and you're just bringing in a search function, they're not going to turn off the search. They may upgrade it, but they're going to give you a path of, we'll support this for 12 months, 18 months. The new versions there will help you upgrade, because that's a core business. That's what they do. So I think that logic is always kind of in the back of my head. When I see little startups who are saying, we've got this brilliant business, it just all feeds off of a Twitter API, and it's like, Twitter's going to turn that off at some point.
I mean, that's I totally agree with that. And I think Zynga was a prime example of that, when Facebook and, as you say, Twitter was renowned for turning a lot of businesses off. I think the Elasticsearch stuff is slightly different, because, as you say, Elastic are a search company. Well, they are moving into AI and other sorts of stuff now, but their predominant business model is operating search. But there's an open source version of it, so you've got that safety net. And also Lucene, which is Apache, that's also open source, as everything's based on. If you wanted to build it yourself, you would just operate at that lower level. And if they did turn their services off and change their license model and all that stuff, you would still always have something to fall back on. So
the challenge with that is, how long will it take you to implement your own version of it, get up to speed, add in the same functionality, integrate it all back? Suddenly what you've done is, because a third-party services change their business model, your roadmap has now been delayed by 6 months, and you've got a huge amount of extra cost while you're implementing all of this yourself.
Yeah. Well, I guess the benefit of doing it as a separate service, though, is that there are other services out there, other search services that you can plug into. So again, it's a natural divide between it's a service-oriented architecture, essentially. You turn one service off and replace it with another one. So for whatever reason, commercially it wasn't working out, or scalability or performance, or as you say, they just decided to go out of business, then it should be quite easy with those defined interfaces to just plug in a different search provider. Yeah,
hopefully. Assuming that the parameters are the same and the results are the same, you're all quids in.
Well, generally,
which isn't always the case.
You've got one input generally, or a set of filters. So yeah, I think generally the inputs will be the same. The output might be different in terms of the response, but if you've got some type of parsing service that does that, then again, you just need to change that one area. So I think it wouldn't be a big issue. Okay.
Anyway, we're 45 minutes in or thereabouts. Do you want to kind of go back to the cost of software and wrap this up?
Yeah, go on then.
I wasn't suggesting I was going to do that. I was hoping you were going to do that.
Everything's like 30 grand, isn't it? Is that what it all works out as?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to be honest, the other thing in all of that is it depends on the size of company you're talking about. If you're an SME and your technology budget's 100 grand a year, and you've got 2 support engineers and you've got a bit of development that you outsource, the whole thing is entirely different to if you're a big multinational and your IT budget is millions or hundreds of millions. But yeah, I think for me though, just to summarize what we've said, is it comes down to what you're trying to achieve. It comes down to the risk reward of that, how procurement get involved and how collaborative you want to be with agencies, and then using third-party services or other services to come in. You've got to be cautious on what you're doing, have that conscious decision making, which is accepting that your roadmap may change, but actually this is where you're heading, and then take a pragmatic view of, do you want to spend more this month because it might save you money in 2 or 3 years time, or are you willing to kind of get to market quickly and have that opportunity and revenue that comes in from being in market quicker? So I think there's several things in there, all of which actually are they make the, for me anyway, they generally make the cost of the software as the least important component in all of this. Whether you're saving 10% in your software or you're costing you an extra 5% in your software, the fact that you're in market quicker, the fact that you're aligned with your supplier, the fact that you've got a conscious decision to use an API rather than build it yourself, the fact that you're building something bespoke because that's where your competitive advantage is. For me, all of those decisions are way more important than saving 10% in your software development.
Yeah, I agree. And just on the flip side is the YAGNI, you ain't going to need it, and the over-engineering. So, thinking that you need something sooner than you need it, you say, get it out to market, get the self-funding.
What was that acronym?
YAGNI.
YAGNI. Okay, that sounds like a Brummie thing.
No, it's not. It's a computer term. YAGNI. You ain't going to need it. Yeah. So don't build it if you're not going to use it. And I guess that's some of the biggest decisions that you make in software development is should I build something for the future? Sometimes not knowing what the future holds. You might have that roadmap, but that roadmap can change. So you don't know that when you come to build it, that the industry is going to just take a massive turn and you need to build something different. So a really good example. I was watching something a bit earlier on. I've not
looked at the entire interview yet, but Airbnb, a year ago, they were headlong into building all the features, all the functions, expanding the business. Suddenly, coronavirus comes and 80% of their business is gone. Suddenly, their entire roadmap is pivoted. And it's like, okay, hopefully we're not going to have a coronavirus every year, but you just don't know what's going to happen in your industry. You don't understand you can't understand what the consumers are going to be thinking in 6 to 12 months. You can predict, you can guess, you can do all of those things, but you don't really know. You have to have that flexibility there.
Okay. Great stuff.
Cool.
Thank you.
Until next week then.
Yeah. See you soon.
Speak to you next week. Cheers, Steve.